Hi there, my name is Alicia Foreman. You might have seen me here at some of our past AMAs, welcoming you to our October 2021 Ask Me Anything session. I'm really happy to have a special guest here with me, along with a familiar face, Matt. Today's Ask Me Anything session is going to be all about test strategy, and we are really happy to have Andras Bubics here from DiUS. DiUS is a consulting partner of Pactflow. Before we jump in, I'm just going to give everyone a bit of an introduction to Andras, who we're really grateful for to provide some time today to ask and have a bit of a discussion about test strategy, including contract testing. So a bit about Andras. He is a lead consultant at DiUS, and he's worked with a bunch of technologies and stacks, including embedded, hardware, IoT, VR, mobile web, and microservices, as well as infra, DevOps, and CI/CD. So that's quite a breadth there, Andras.
A little bit of everything.
A little bit of everything. Andras recently did a talk with Skills Matter, where he discussed using contract testing to speed up development and deployment and to abolish end-to-end tests. And so this talk is really just off the back of that, and we will be discussing a couple of questions in relation to test strategy. We also, as I said, have Matt here. Matt is one of the co-founders of Pactflow, and so he and Andras will be having a discussion about test strategy. If before we get started, we do have a couple of questions that we've tabled just to get the discussion going, but we are here and available to answer any questions as we call this and Ask Me Anything. If you do have a question, please pop it into the chat here in YouTube. You can also catch us over on the Pact Slack channel in Pactflow AMA. All right, let's kick it off. Matt and Andras, if you wanted to have some questions, let's get talking.
I guess let's start at the start, hey. So Andras did a great talk a few months ago for Skills Matter. As Alicia said, it's about I guess in the end it's mostly about like how do you move faster to release software. How do you use contract testing as part of that? But the talk was a lot wider than contract testing. So we thought it was a really good opportunity just to sort of dive a bit deeper into some of that thinking and maybe tease it out a bit further. And so maybe as a really good starting point, Andras, if you could just give us a bit of a synopsis of that talk that you did, and a bit of a tease, and we can use that to launch into some of the other questions.
Yeah, I guess the kind of intent for that talk was we've always got lots of existing kind of Pact and contract testing talks that are getting a little bit samey, and there hasn't been a lot of mobile stuff, so there was a little bit of kind of a slightly different angle to bring a bit more variety to the content that already exists about contract testing and strategy there. But I think another part of that intent was a lot of people want to get straight into contract testing, but some of the prerequisites aren't always hit. So it was a bit bigger, like not just how do you do contract testing if you don't necessarily have the context of what you're injecting contract testing into. Really, how does contract testing fit into the bigger strategy of automated testing and other kind of software testing integration or continuous integration, development and delivery? So there was a little bit of like, what is contract testing? What problem does that solve? And then how do we integrate that into an existing code base or a new code base? And what kind of benefits does that give us? And how does that affect the kind of footprint of the different kinds of testing? And how can we balance all of those different kinds of testing to get the kind of confidence that we need to deploy continuously?
Yeah, I like the I guess you use the word like reasoning power a lot when we talk, offline as well as in this talk as well. And the idea being, the way I interpret that is, reasoning power is giving you the information you need to make decisions, right? So ultimately, testing is just about giving you some level of confidence. It's a risk management. It helps give you confidence around releasing software, basically, right? So,
yeah, exactly.
Thinking of testing as getting 100% coverage, was probably the norm, a while back. But then I guess we thought about it and went, well, 100% coverage, what does that actually mean? Does that mean we're foolproof? It means there's literally no bugs in the code? Well, no, that just means we've covered all the lines of code potentially and all the paths of code, but does that actually tell you what you need? Does that give you the confidence you need? Well, probably not. It probably gives you some more confidence over having no tests whatsoever, but it doesn't tell you that you have confidence. So reasoning is like a different way of approaching it almost. It's like, can I reason about my code? And if I can reason about my code better, then I can think about how to get the coverage I need better. And that gives me more confidence. So maybe, how do you think about, I guess, reasoning, and maybe, moving into how you actually might slice and dice things up so that you get that reasoning power?
I think generally as a kind of programming approach, I try and take it quite mathematically. So, I mean, maths isn't really about numbers and arithmetics and calculus so much as building models that help you predict what's going to happen if you do stuff in the real world. So I like to do that in the way that I approach programming. So carve up things with single responsibility and well understood interfaces and boundaries. And that approach flows through into helping make code testable, and also make code so that it doesn't need to be tested because certain categories of problems and errors can't exist in the first place, as long as like you trust the rest of the tooling. So if you've got like a type-safe containers or a static strongly typed language, that reduces the kinds of errors that you can have because the compiler won't even let you run it. But that's kind of an aside. For the testing kind of reasoning stuff, I think, I don't know if you've got the slides from the skills matter thing handy, but I did kind of mock up a little diagram of, say, you've got a two-tier app. So you've got a mobile front end or a web front end, and then you've got an API or a BFF and an API backing that, or other backend services kind of backing that. Yeah, that's the one. And then you don't want to just test all of those together because that's slow and flaky, basically. But which bits can you test in different chunks, and what kind of reasoning power or confidence does that give you that all of the software does work, either in individual bits like units or components, or altogether like integrated or functional or end-to-end or contract tests. And do those individual bits that aren't the whole thing give you enough confidence to say that, yes, I'm happy to deploy this and I'm pretty sure that it's not going to have any bugs. And how pretty sure you can be is affected by coverage, but also knowing what's inside the software, and knowing what you need to cover with tests to give you that confidence. Like if I know I've got a string transform function, I don't need to test every string in the universe to prove that it transforms properly.
Yeah, and I think like just going through your slides here, right? You've got, well, we're starting at, this is a kind of an end-to-end view of the world, right? So we're testing we're testing an end-to-end environment. So that gray scope is saying, well, we're the Android team, so we want to make sure our piece of software works. So we test the whole system, and then the iOS team's like, well, we're going to do the same thing because we want to make sure our piece of software works. So we test our bit, and then the rest of the system. And what happens there is you've got a huge amount of duplication for starters. But also, of course, you need to have you need environments running. You need to line up all the things you need to do to get end-to-end testing going. And I think to your previous slide here, like, well, what happens if we add other consumers to that BFF? Do they have to do the same thing? So now all of a sudden, we've got huge amounts of overlapping concern basically from the BFF, downwards. So how do we, maybe not do that? And how do we, make that much more efficient for starters? So, just for those in the audience, rather than having to test this gigantic ball of, this glob of everything, can we be a bit more targeted in that testing? And that enables us to be, not so general. We can be much more specific with the types of testing we're doing and give us different levels of confidence from different levels. So we work through this, what we would, encourage as what we tend to encourage. And I think this is what's nice about Android, Andras' slides here. You're not Android, are you, Andras? We start with unit tests, so everyone gets that. But unit tests is definitely not going to get you where you want to get to. They're going to give you fast, reliable, readable, comprehensible, deterministic tests, but you cannot paint this entire picture and give yourself confidence if you just did unit tests. So We layer on a few more. We look at doing some functional tests that cover slightly larger boundaries. We do some UI tests to make sure that that they work expectedly, but of course you need to mock out the back end. And up until this point, most people will do that, and then they'll just do their end-to-end tests on top of that. And this is where we would suggest contract testing can help come in and basically find the arrows, and again take away just one more responsibility from those end-to-end tests. So and I guess we'll talk about this probably, but where does end-to-end testing fit into this picture? We don't necessarily say end-to-end testing is wrong or inherently bad necessarily. I think we can have a conversation about how it gets used. What, in my experience, I'm keen to get your thoughts too, is that I see that basically being abused. It's like, well, we don't have the rigor, the various levels of abstraction to do this form of testing. So we just test it from the outside because it's convenient mentally, at least. We don't have to think about a different way of doing it. We just do a catch-all form of testing. And so contract testing just helps you give one extra piece of confidence as you're moving forward, where you don't have to do so many more end-to-end tests to test those collaborations between components. But it doesn't also it doesn't cover other things, which we can probably talk about as well.
Yeah, exactly. And the smaller the boxes are, the more thorough the testing can be, and the faster it can be to run, and the less flaky because it hasn't got as many moving parts. So the biggest, scariest, slowest one is the end-to-end. It's easiest to do in some senses because you've got one entry point and you touch all the parts, and you don't as long as everything's up, it's easy to test. But that's only really easy to do in the live prod system or any of the other fully formed systems. So unless you can automate spinning everything up and down really quickly, that gets expensive.
Yeah, totally. And I guess you sort of this final slide here sort of shows how you map the various layers of testing back onto the pyramid. I guess I'm really keen to hear from you as well. How do you think about tools like the pyramid, and are they still relevant? What's missing from the pyramid? Yeah, maybe I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's still a useful starting point for thinking about this stuff. I don't think it's really lost much relevance. It's not a fully comprehensive picture, I guess. But I mean, it kind of branches off into multi-dimensional ways of thinking in different disciplines, and infrastructure and DevOps and automation and CI/CD, which are hard to encapsulate in a nice simple picture. But I think definitely thinking about I don't know if everyone knows Kent Beck's test desiderata post that has here's a list of attributes or properties that different kinds of tests could have. You can't have all of them at the same time. You can't have high specificity and also high integration because they're in tension. So thinking about all the different combinations of those gives you different kinds of profiles that you can think about. It's still good to say we want robots or computers to do most of the automated stuff. If we can automate stuff that's specific and not flaky, then that frees up people to do human stuff, because people aren't good at doing repetitive stuff and noticing small differences. They're better at doing exploratory stuff and noticing surprising things that are hard for computers to have scripted into them. So yeah, I think it's still totally useful. Having the shape still like this kind of highlights the bits where you want to spend the most effort and get more or less coverage. So you don't want automated end-to-end tests to be very, very thorough, but you do want them to have a light touch on everything. And maybe that is like a smoke test or something. You've already done all of this thorough testing in the isolated parts and small integrations, and then you deploy, and before you send traffic to your app or whatever the situation is for your particular architecture, then you make sure that all the bits can talk to each other. And with all the built up smaller bits of confidence and then bigger links of confidence, you can be sure that once you've got that smoke level test, that everything will work well together. And yeah, get regular people to focus on the leftover bits that you can't script.
Yeah, totally. And I think expanding that to like different dimensions that you talked about. There's a good post from Cindy Sritaran. I think there's quite a long post. I think it's called is it testing microservices better? Or basically everything about microservices and testing is part of it. And she proposes like this testing funnel. or at least puts together this testing funnel, which is, again, it's really just a different view of it. It doesn't tell you, I think what's great about this heuristic is it says where to spend your time. It's really a heuristic about where you should spend time, not necessarily what kinds of testing you could be doing. I think the pyramid started there, but as you can see here, this is just one extra view of the pyramid, right? And then there's 10 other versions of this thing. So just in an abstract sense, the pyramid is really spend more time at the bottom writing, much more targeted, fast, reliable tests, spend less time at the top. And, just like your food pyramid, right? There's no clear lines necessarily between all of them, but you can use that abstraction to think about that. But the Sydney Sridharan one is kind of interesting because it talks about when to run the test. And this doesn't tell you about that really. This pyramid is missing that dimension. And,
totally.
One thing we talk about with our customers is like, well, how do we get rid of end-to-end tests? Pact isn't going to remove your end-to-end test completely by itself. And we're like, yeah, it's not going to do that. Usually it's a 2 or 3 things you would need to do. Introducing something like contract testing, that takes away a large amount of the end-to-end tests that look for communication between systems. Second thing is normally adding a lot more functional tests. And really in the middle of the pyramid, we find that's actually most customers seem to have much more end-to-end tests, usually some amount of unit test and very little integration tests in the middle. And I'm using integration tests in the broader context here, not integrated tests. And we find that a lot of the end-to-end tests are really just the consumers testing the provider's behavior. And that's not, we don't want to do that. The provider can test their own behavior. The consumer should test their own behavior, and we should find some responsibility to test everyone's behavior. And we find that oftentimes it's organizational that gets to that point, right? Where you've got an organizational structure that says your responsibility for some testing team, for example, you're the ones responsible for doing the end-to-end testing. So they end up doing it all again, irrespective of what the other teams have done. To test their behavior. So that's a very crude way of doing that, right? It's not very targeted. It very much happens from the outside. But one thing we talk about is, okay, well, we still want to do some form of end-to-end testing. And one thing we definitely would encourage is production testing, and specifically like synthetic monitoring and semantic monitoring. So for example, at Pactflow, every minute we run a series of end-to-end tests that do a series of transactions, like can we publish and verify a contract, and basically run through the key scenarios. If they don't work, that means our customers can't do the key scenario either. And unsurprisingly, those tests don't fail very often at all because they're tied to a pager. And if the pager goes off, then we get woken up and we have to fix it. And no one likes to be woken up. And so what happens is any things that run like that in production tend to become reliable very quickly. I guess, do you have any sort of strategies as well to sort of help just color off the end of that pyramid to try and get some extra confidence?
That was a very long question.
I think it's mostly a statement and then a very small question at the end. Yeah. What other tips do you have in terms of, is there a separate dimension for it that we should be thinking about? And, is this picture complete?
Yeah, I think really testing is just one of the ways to get confidence, and automated testing definitely isn't the only signal that you can use to find out when things are not working. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of stuff around around monitoring and alerting, even other kinds of health metrics around like response times, response like status code rates. Like we get these many kind of 400 range API responses and these many 500 range and these many 2 or whatever other range. If one of those drops off the graph, but you're not getting errors, that's a different flavor of signal to show you that stuff is broken. So definitely testing isn't the only thing. One of the issues that I come across pretty often is sometimes there are testing teams that are only focused on testing automation or manual testing, and they don't get integrated very well with ops or DevOps kind of teams that are more interested in monitoring and infrastructure alerting. So really kind of helping people get more cross-functional and understanding or empathizing with the different kinds of concerns and not only trying to do their own thing. Like if you have developers only doing unit testing, then maybe they don't have enough empathy for the other kinds of things that can go wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Let's make sure we don't talk for too long, and we'll answer one of the questions we got from the community, which is a question from Matt which is, hello, I have a question for the team. What are the anti-patterns of contract testing? Did you want to have a starting point at that, Andras?
Yeah, that's it's not something I usually have to think about too much, but it definitely comes up in Slack quite a bit.
I think you touched on one of them just now, right? I think you talked about empathy, right? And testing not being it's not one person's responsibility. It's a collective responsibility. I would say from a contract testing point of view, from just organizationally structured, I think a couple of things we do see. We often will see contract testing, at least with Pact. I think we should be we should be clear here that we're probably going to take the Pact view of the world, but contract testing is a more general topic. But from Pact's perspective, Pact is very much a developer tool. It is really meant to be a unit testing tool. And so if you don't think of it like a unit test, then you're probably going to run into a bunch of issues. So a classic anti-pattern would be testing against a live environment. So you can do it, but it's very problematic, and it's likely to lead you to the same kinds of problems you get with end-to-end testing, because you can't necessarily control the environment. So the moment that you're pointing at some external entity that's accessible to others, somebody else could start mutating that environment by simply interacting with it. So end-to-end tests are the kinds of things that fail because someone is running the battery of tests against a fixed environment. They've just got their data fixture set up and all that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden, some tester or some developer comes along and starts logging in and doing things. And all of a sudden, they're mutating the same data that test's running, and all of a sudden the test fail, right? And you can't understand why, because you just set it up and it was all good, and it stopped working. So that's a good example of where you don't really want to do that, especially if you have lots of builds running, all pointing at that environment. Well, then now you're going to be running lots of builds against the same environment. You're just going to tie yourselves in knots. So that's probably the first one. And back on the people thing, that usually lends itself to, it really is a developer tool. So you need to be part of the team writing the code, because it's a unit testing tool. It's running as part of your code. It really needs to be written by somebody who's writing the code in the first place. So just like a tester wouldn't write the unit test for a function that a developer wrote, it's very similar with the contract test. So they're probably the two ones that come most immediately to my mind.
Yep. I guess from a kind of strategy perspective, less Pact specific, trying to eliminate categories of tests by replacing all of them with contract tests is kind of a pitfall as well. I think you can reduce things like end-to-end and integrated tests, but the goal isn't to completely get rid of them. Otherwise, you miss a different kind of confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably just another one to add there would be the functional testing. So sometimes, again, people will come from functional testing tools like Postman, and we'll often get questions like, in Postman, I could do this. And Postman is a great tool. It's a handy little tool. We still use it for all kinds of things, but it's not the kind of tool that Pact is. So if you're thinking of Pact as I'm specifically trying to exercise the API, and coming from that functional testing point of view, you'll probably find yourself tied in knots, because it's not designed for that. And an extension of that would be, where people use that to do boundary type testing. So you'll start hitting an API with all kinds of variations of text, for example. That isn't really meaningful to the contract usually. So like, I want to test with, Andras's name. I want to test with some UTF-8 character, or UTF type characters where it's maybe it's a Chinese character set or whatever it is. I'm going to start boundary testing that way. That's not usually very helpful from a contract testing point of view. Definitely something you want to do as part of your testing, but from a Pact point of view, you don't want to do that. And the main reason for that is anything you put into the contract on the consumer side, the provider has to verify. And so you really want to make sure that you've just got the minimum set of things in that contract that gives you confidence that the two things can talk to each other. Anything else is going to be maintenance overhead or worse. And then an extension of that is when you see Pact being used in user interface tests. So again, if let's say using tools like Cypress or Selenium or any of those kinds of things, if you're driving tests that way, inevitably you haven't got the specificity that Andras was talking about. You don't have a really narrow focus set of tests. So it means you're testing further out from the code, which means you're going to be testing more code for starters, and it's going to be more coarse-grained. So you can actually generate more scenarios into the contract. And that's, again, going to create a burden for the provider team to have to deal with all those different scenarios. So usually what happens there is you just have way too many interactions for what it actually needs to cover.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about it, which is like any of the consumer side contracts put a burden on the provider as well. So if it's not relevant to the provider, maybe that should be in a different kind of test, like a unit test or a UI validation test or something like that.
Yep, and Ron made a point there around testing optional values. That's something becomes up so often on the forums. Is
so much.
It's, again, probably comes from that sort of functional testing point of view. I've got an API that may conditionally return back a null value or something else, and I just want to write a test that says it can be null or it can be not null. And from a contract testing point of view, if we assume it's null or we assume it's a value and not null, it just means we're missing one of those key scenarios. So if we only test one scenario, but in production the other scenario happens, that's basically the opposite of, it's either a value is there or not. We can't be sure that your code can deal with the value being there or not being there. So there's a whole blog on that one.
We need to explicitly cater for both cases. Otherwise, how do you have the confidence that it always works? Yeah,
exactly.
I guess one of the older kind of anti-pattern things that's been made a feature instead of an anti-pattern is what was solved with bidirectional testing. So trying to write the tests from the provider side instead of the consumer side, which is more of a Pact issue than a contract testing generally issue, or a consumer side contract testing issue specifically.
Yep. So we have a few questions here as well that have just come through. So they actually all sound, some of them sound from a similar perspective. We've kind of got one question, which is from Sweetheart, that says, with one tester in the team working across multiple services, what's the best approach to come up with the contract testing, and when to and where to start out of the two services? I think the second one is around how do you manage contract tests when you're only part of the consumer team? So I think maybe that the question there is, maybe you're a tester or maybe you're an SDET or helping to introduce contract testing across those teams. Where should you start? I guess where to start and how to spend your time. Did you want to have a crack at that, Andras? I'm happy to answer.
Yeah. So I think starting with stuff that is either currently or recently worked on is a good point, because more people will have the context to make sure that all the important cases are being covered for that bit of the contract. You definitely want to start from the consumer side if you can, because that's the party that describes what the interface should look like, ideally. I think that's kind of the start of the answer. You've got more to add to that?
Yeah, that's what I would do. I would, I guess you kind of go. We have a few articles as well that sort of talk to this. I might put a link to that in the video afterwards. It's sort of like how to get started with contract testing, and maybe how to prioritize what to do first. I tend to gravitate to the things with the most impact. So, what Andras said makes sense. If you've recently worked on the code, it's also going to be fresh in your mind. It's probably changing as well, so it's a good time to do it. But also, lean into the pain. Like if you've got, this is the thing that's causing us number one pain, and you want to show that this thing can make a difference, then lean into the pain and prove that. You got to balance it up with, if that's a really difficult piece of software to change, that might be not where you want to start. So, for example, you looked at it and go, Pact isn't ideally suited to that yet, and we don't have the capability to think about how we do it. Find a good starting point, get some rhythm, and then move into it. So there's kind of no one right or wrong answer there, but I normally gravitate to the pain.
Yeah, I think some dangers there are also if you're a solo tester and none of the devs are interested in helping with contract testing, that can be a blocker for everything else to come after that. So be careful if you're doing a POC, trying to make sure that that Pact is a good fit or whatever. Don't try and get like full coverage or anything. Get like one or two interactions working. Get something integrated into CI so that it's actually working end to end rather than just working on a local machine. Don't get stuck as a solo tester without any dev help and without any automation to back it.
Yeah, really good point. How can we manage contract tests when you're the only part of the consumer team? So Ajit, I'm going to assume maybe you're floating between teams, or you're sort of helping maybe coach or do some of that implementation. I think what Andras just said is probably the thing that's at most front of mind. As I said before, I would say normally the developer will be the one who writes the code, right? So if you're floating in and not actually contributing the code that would actually be contract tested, that's probably the first barrier you got to work through. So I would say you're probably more going to be in a coaching type role or in a coordination type role to try and get the outcomes you need. So in terms of getting it as part of that, probably the starting point is getting a spike in place as a team, and maybe that's one of your sprint goals or something, is to get contract testing in and pair with a team member or something like that to roll that out. And then over time you build some competency in the group and you can float between different teams and help coach them and help them make it successful. But ultimately contract testing is like unit testing. So just think about anything you think about with unit testing, that's what it needs to be with contract testing. So if you're only running contract testing when you're there and it's not happening when you're not there, that just tells me there's going to be a gap in your testing coverage at the moment you're not around. So build that in from the start, I think, is the way to think of that.
Yeah, totally. That's its own kind of separate problem, regardless of the tools.
Yep. And we got one from Siddharth, and probably this will be the last one before we wrap it up. Is, I guess another question comes up is that what part of the overall? So I've lost my mouse. There we go. What part of the overall testing overhead will Pact and contract testing replace? We already discussed that end-to-end testing should be minimized but cannot be eliminated. So I should say that really how much end-to-end testing you have is really up to a bunch of different balancing acts. The rule we called Scurry's Law, which is after Beth because she came up with it. And this is just a general rule of thumb. So there is no, mathematical detail here, but think about it as, the number of end-to-end tests you have is somewhat proportional to essentially your mean time to recovery and the impact of that problem. So if you can recover really quickly and the impact is low in most cases, you can probably get rid of end-to-end tests, probably, or at least it's a plausible outcome. If the mean time to recovery for an issue is really long and or the problem is really serious, like it's a pacemaker or something, there's software for a pacemaker, for whatever reason that needs to talk to the cloud. That sounds scary, but let's say that's the case. You probably want to have a lot more end-to-end tests, and your release cycle is going to be slower anyway. So I think these are the things that are part of the balancing act. The first project I had when we did Pact testing was I guess more of a consumer or it's a business-facing product. If it went down for 5 seconds, it would not be the end of the world. Now that would still be a terrible thing, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. And so the team was more optimized for throughput of the system and recovering quickly and rollbacks and these kinds of checks. That was more important to the team than feeling like we had the confidence that those end-to-end tests gave us. So that's the first part of my answer. I guess more directly answering it, the main part of what contract testing does is removes the kinds of tests you need to do an end-to-end test to make sure systems are able to communicate to one another, which is usually some large proportion of your end-to-end tests. The other usual large fractional amount of the end-to-end test is functional tests, which usually can be removed from end-to-end tests anyway and put elsewhere. So what we see from a Pactflow point of view is most customers using contract testing, it's usually a trigger to actually reevaluate the testing pyramid, and contract testing just happens to be part of removing a lot of the end-to-end tests. Andras, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think if it helps to bring it from another perspective as well, if you can imagine not coming from already having all these end-to-end tests, but if you come from the other end of the pyramid and say, we've got all of these unit tests, they give us this kind of confidence. We've got these functional tests. We've got these contract tests where we still don't have confidence about these other areas. Maybe those are the areas you still want to have end-to-end tests on. And if those end-to-end tests are blowing out too much, or if the functional tests or any other integrated tests are blowing out too much, then that kind of is the signal that here is a bunch of kind of things that we do need better low-level confidence in. So that highlights the lower hanging fruit of the stuff that's causing you problems that you want to get more confidence on at different levels as well. And maybe you won't get rid of it completely, but you'll move more of it out of the end-to-end part of the testing.
Yeah, seems like a good way to wrap up there. Thanks, Andras. Thanks for all the questions as well. I think we'll leave it there, but I'll just leave one more question for Andras before we go, a really simple one. I guess where can people hear more or see more from you? How can they get in contact if they want to?
That's a great question. I am on Twitter, but not in a very professional capacity. I do hang out in the DiUS public Slack community workspace that we've got. I think link to that can go in the description if it's not already.
Yep.
I'm a GDG, so Google Developer Groups Melbourne organizer, and a Random Hacks of Kindness Melbourne organizer. So yeah, I can be found in different community places on Meetup as well. That's probably most of it.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Andras. Really appreciate your perspective as always. And I'll hand back to Alicia.
No worries. Good to be here.
Matt, you've tied up the loose ends here and you've done my job for me. Yeah, I appreciate both of your time this evening. It was really good to have you both have that discussion, and thank you to those people who provided us some questions as well. It's always really great to get some audience engagement. That's it for now. We are in the process of planning our November AMA as well, so please stay tuned for news of that. We're hoping to have one of our other partners along as guest speakers. All right, well, Andras and Matt, have a lovely evening, and everyone else out there, enjoy the rest of your day or evening wherever you are. Thank you.
Awesome.
Cheers. Thanks very much.
Thanks, folks. Okay.